Hello again, everybody. Welcome to this week's episode of My Thoughts. This week we'll be discussing the several things from the Bill of Rights and the Second Amendment. Yes, this is based on the fact that there was yet again another mass shooting. Okay. And of course, on Thursday, President Biden said that he would be working on an executive order for gun control. Okay, let's go over a few things that have been occurring. In the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, Bill of Rights, things like freedom of speech and freedom of religion. Freedom of speech means that you can speak without social political oppression. It is generally interpreted that this comes from the government, meaning that if you say something wrong, or if you say something that is considered unacceptable by your employer, that if they fire you, it is not a violation of your First Amendment. Well, there's a couple of problems with that. First of all, the entire premise of our government is we the people. So if an individual says something, they make a comment, and the rest of society goes out of their way to notify everyone else where this person lives, where their family lives, where they work. That way their family can be intimidated, their employer can be intimidated into firing them. That they can be harassed and forced to move from their home, then yes, that is a violation of their First Amendment. This so-called doxing, where do they get this name doxing, is indeed a violation of the First Amendment. Society ganging up and intimidating someone to force them out of society, to force them out of employment, to prevent them from being able to shop and buy groceries, basic necessities of life, because this group of people decides that they don't like what the person said, then yes, that is a violation of freedom of speech. Does freedom of speech cover hate speech? Well, first, one has to define what is hate speech. To say that hate speech is something that the majority of society is opposed to just opens the way to censor and violate the First Amendment. Are there reprehensible comments made by people that should not be said in public? Yes. However, our government, our court, and our society do not have a right to deny the person to be able to say it. If I choose not to work with them, so be it, that's my choice. If I encourage other people to deny them basic abilities to live, then that is wrong. Also in the First Amendment is freedom of religion, something that is commonly in pop culture being referred to as freedom from religion, because it states that the U.S. government will not make laws respecting a specific religion. It further states, or prevent people from their freedom to freely express their religion. So yes, everyone has a right to pray. You have a right to your religious beliefs. What you don't have is a right to force that on anyone else. However, the fact that you do not have a right to force your religious beliefs does not mean that the government or the mob has a right to prevent you from your beliefs. Using the pandemic as an excuse to close churches, and specifically as Andrew Cuomo and Bill de Blasio said in New York, that if these, and they targeted a specific religion, if these Jewish congregations went to temple in any capacity, that they would shut them down permanently. That directly violates the First Amendment, stating that, oh, you don't understand, there's a pandemic and people are dying. So, people are dying every day anyway. People were dying every day before the pandemic. People will die every day after the pandemic. No one lives forever. The question is not, will I continue to live? It's, how will I continue to live? No one has a right to prevent anyone else from the free expression of their religion that does not infringe on other people's rights. Guess what? That means that saying a prayer before dinner at a restaurant is not violating the rights of the people at the other tables who are like, oh my goodness, they're praying. I don't want that stuff forced on me. Nobody's forcing it. Nobody's standing up and saying, everyone, put down your forks. No. They're bowing their heads, minding their own business. So mind your own damn business. And using any form of government or judicial system to prevent people from these lawfully allowed forms of religion is indeed supporting a state-mandated religion of atheism. That's still a religion. There are limits, yes, in that one cannot express their religious beliefs that violate other people's rights. Islamic extremists. I know, oh, that's Islamophobic. No. Same thing would be if there were Christian extremists, and there have been. Branch Davidian comes to mind. But in both of those cases, use of force to mandate compliance with religious beliefs are violations. If we still had religions in the world that called for human sacrifice, those would be illegal because they violate someone else's basic human rights, even if the person is willing. Even if it's a willing volunteer, it's still a violation. Sorry, no can do. Now, what our society has done and is violating is using mob rule to embarrass and intimidate people into preventing them from expressing their religion and making comments like, well, you can keep that in your own house. Well, no, I can do that wherever I want. And under our current popular culture, if a child goes to school on one of these rare days they're allowed to interact with other humans, and they say, oh, we have a family prayer, then our current popular culture involves calling CPS to report them for child abuse for indoctrinating them in some religious belief. Well, guess what? That is perfectly acceptable. Parents are allowed to teach their religion to their children. That is not abuse. Christians teaching their children that homosexuality is a sin is not abuse. The child may be gay, they may grow up, go off on their own. That's their right. But guess what? It is the right of religious people who believe that such things are violations of their morality to teach that to their children. It's not abuse. Teaching an underage child that anal sex is acceptable is abuse. Using excuses like, well, the neighbors saw you do something through your window, therefore we can use that as evidence to prosecute, saying that does not violate the Fourth Amendment's right against unreasonable search and seizure because it wasn't the police who did it, is a proxy argument. That's like the person driving a getaway car in a bank robbery saying, well, I never entered the bank, so I wasn't involved. I was just driving a car. No, the person driving the car is still complicit with the crime. So a neighbor peeking through a window and seeing that someone has something and saying that that's not unreasonable search and seizure because it wasn't the police is still a violation of the Fourth Amendment. The Fifth Amendment, the right to not incriminate yourself, is being violated by people being considered guilty on social media and thus made pariahs who cannot commit basic life requirements such as work, food, housing. Violation of the Fifth Amendment. The Second Amendment, the right of the people to own and bear arms. Okay. The amendment states that a well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security and safety of a free people, the right of the people to own and bear arms shall not be infringed. There are people who are currently trying to claim that that means the government has a right to have a standing military to protect the people, and the people as a community have a right to own and bear arms for the purposes of having the standing military. Yet there is no way to legitimately interpret that. The right of the people to be free in their own right. They have the right to own and bear arms. Now, some people say that only applies to muskets because it was written in a time of muskets. Well, that's actually factually not true. The British Army used muskets because they were mass-produced for cheap labor. The U.S. colonials actually had rifled muzzle loaders, which were far superior to random muskets because they were used for hunting and self-defense against the evil Indians. Yeah, I know. Oh, that's racist. Well, guess what? When the Native Americans said, oh, let's kill all these white people, that was racist too. But we're going to keep that part out. The right of the people to own and bear arms ensures that the governments, local, state, and federal, have reasonable cause to believe that a homeowner may be armed. And people use the case of Breonna Taylor. Her boyfriend shot a cop and got away with it. Yes, he shot a cop because the cops were breaking and entering. The counter argument was that they had a warrant signed by a judge. All a warrant is approval from a judge for law enforcement to violate one law in order to enforce another. Any person forcing entry into a private dwelling is breaking and entering. Just saying that, oh, well, they're law enforcement does not change the fact that they are breaking and entering. Oh, well, they had a warrant. That's a judge's approval to break and enter. It is judicial approval to violate basic human rights. And saying that it's for the greater good does not change the fact that it is violating basic human rights. Saying that, and using the argument of, well, people in a civilized society don't need firearms. Well, the American colonies were a civilized society. Medieval Europe was a civilized society. They didn't even have guns yet. Feudal Japan was a civilized society. If you're interested in the history of those places, in feudal Japan and medieval Europe, peasants were not allowed to own weapons. Only the aristocracy were allowed to own weapons, and the aristocracy in both locations could, at any time, choose to terminate the lives of any peasants they felt like, violating basic human rights in a civilized society. Hitler took guns. Mussolini took guns. Emperor Tojo of Japan simply never allowed them to be had in the first place. Joseph Stalin. All of these people took firearms away from their societies. In medieval times, they prevented peasants from having swords so that they could not defend themselves. And in every one of those cases, the administrations, violated the basic human rights of their citizens. Saying that we're enlightened now, if we're so enlightened now, then why do we have warrants signed by judges permitting police officers to break and enter into private dwellings? Because civilized society does not eliminate criminal activity. In the case of Breonna Taylor, guess what? Her ex-boyfriend, who was the criminal in question, was not there, hadn't been there. They had been broken up. The investigating officers knew they had been broken up. There was no excuse to have that warrant. But the state did it anyway. The right of the people to own and bear arms does not even apply to firearms, or does not only apply to firearms. It applies to arms, whether those be guns, cannons, swords, axes, baseball bats. The right of the people to be safe in their self and in their dwelling shall not be violated. The Second Amendment isn't even just about self-defense. It's about defense from tyrannical governments, foreign and domestic. Do we generally have a need to defend ourselves by force from our own government? No. In general, we do not. When Ted Bundy and all those cattle ranchers and associates decided, oh, you're not going to confiscate my cattle for failure to pay for grazing rights, armed federal agents went to intervene, and armed U.S. citizens responded. Were those U.S. citizens right? Hey, from my personal opinion, no. Because public lands are for everyone. If you are going to graze cattle, you have to pay for the opportunity to use everyone else's land. But that's my opinion. Remember, the more we allow an administration to take away our rights, the more they will keep them, and we will not see them again. Power seeks power, and it does not give it up willingly. Y'all have a good week.